Your grocery bill is up 28% from 2 years ago. And according to the FAO, the World Bank, and the USDA, it's not stopping there. Experts are projecting another surge, potentially hitting 35 to 45% higher by late 2026. So how did a basic trip to the supermarket end up costing more than a car payment? Your grandparents knew something you don't. When times got tight, really tight, they didn't panic. They planted 8 specific crops, chosen not for taste, not for variety, but for survival math. Maximum calories per square foot, low cost from seed, and the ability to store through a long winter without a freezer. Those 8 crops are what this is about. The numbers came out of Rome in June 2026. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations published its mid-year assessment, and the headline was brutal: a 35 to 45% global food price surge, expected by the end of the year. Not a projection for 2040, not a worst-case scenario buried in a footnote, a near-term forecast backed by converging data from 3 continents. Here's what's driving it. California's Central Valley, which produces roughly a third of America's vegetables, has been hammered by back-to-back drought years. Reservoirs that once held hundreds of billions of gallons sat at historic lows. Farmers fallowed fields they'd irrigated for generations. The soil cracked in long, pale seams across ground that used to run with irrigation water. You could walk those fields in July and hear nothing. No pumps, no sprinklers, just wind moving across dry earth. The Midwest grain belt recorded its worst soil moisture levels in over a decade. Harvests came in short, prices went up, and that was before the supply chain problems hit. The war in Ukraine didn't just displace millions of people. It strangled the global supply of wheat, sunflower oil, and corn. Ukraine and Russia together account for nearly 30% of the world's wheat exports. That pipeline has been disrupted for years now, and the ripple effects are still moving through the system. Flour prices climbed, bread prices followed, feed grain costs pushed up the price of every animal product downstream. The Middle East conflicts added more pressure, port delays, shipping insurance spikes, rerouted cargo adding weeks and hundreds of dollars per container to every voyage. Dock workers in 3 countries walked off the job in the same quarter, containers piled up, perishables rotted, prices climbed again. Then came the fertilizer crisis. Geopolitical blocs cut off key suppliers. Prices for nitrogen-based fertilizers tripled in some markets. Farmers in developing nations simply stopped applying them. They couldn't afford to. Yields dropped. Harvests shrank. And a 2024 IPCC-linked study projected crop yield reductions of 15 to 25% through 2027 across major growing regions. That's not a blip. That's a structural shift. The kind that doesn't reverse in a single season or even a single decade. And here's what makes this moment different from every other food price spike in recent memory. It's not one problem. It's 5 problems arriving simultaneously. Climate stress on supply, geopolitical disruption of trade routes, energy costs embedded in every step of industrial agriculture, labor shortages in processing and transport, and a financial system that has been quietly withdrawing from agricultural investment for years, leaving the whole structure thinner and more brittle than anyone officially admits. This is the storm, and most people are walking straight into it without a plan. 1932, rural Appalachia. A family of 6 is eating through winter on what they grew and stored themselves. The father wakes before dawn, pulls on boots still damp from the previous evening, and walks out to check the root cellar before breakfast. He's not checking out of habit. He's calculating how many weeks of potatoes remain, whether the squash in the far corner has started to soften, whether the dried beans in the burlap sacks are holding dry. He runs his hand along the top layer of potatoes, pressing gently with 2 fingers, checking for soft spots the way a doctor checks for swelling. One bad potato left unchecked can rot the ones around it. He knows this. His father taught him. His father's father taught his father. He planted the same 8 crops his father planted. No agricultural degree, no extension service pamphlet, just accumulated knowledge passed down through hard seasons that told him exactly which plants would keep his family fed when the money ran out. He didn't grow tomatoes for winter. He didn't grow lettuce. He grew what stored. He grew what yielded. He grew what cost almost nothing to replant year after year. That philosophy didn't die with the Depression. It just got forgotten when supermarkets made it easy to stop thinking about where food comes from. But the logic behind it is ironclad, and it's more relevant right now than it has been in decades. Old-timers chose crops by 3 rules: not flavor, not novelty, not what looked good in a seed catalog. The first rule was yield per square foot. If a plant didn't produce enough food to justify the ground it occupied, it didn't get planted. Simple as that. A single 10-foot row of pole beans can produce upwards of 30 pounds of beans across a season. That same 10 feet of ground planted with bell peppers might give you 8 pounds. The math wasn't complicated, it was ruthless. The second rule was storability. A crop that rotted in 2 weeks was a luxury. A crop that lasted 6 months in a root cellar was a lifeline. Old-timers weren't growing food for Tuesday's dinner, they were growing food for February. That distinction shaped every decision they made about what went in the ground. They thought in seasons, not in meals. They thought in months, not in days. That shift in time horizon changed everything about what they planted. The third rule was input cost. These families weren't buying bags of synthetic fertilizer from a garden center. They were composting kitchen scraps, saving seeds from last year's harvest, and choosing plants that could thrive in average soil without coddling. A crop that needed expensive amendments or constant irrigation was a crop that could bankrupt you in a bad year. The 8 crops on this list were chosen because they ask almost nothing from you and give back an enormous amount. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because when researchers at the USDA began analyzing historical kitchen garden records from the 1920s and 1930s, actual planting logs kept by farming families, ledger books with handwritten entries tracking seed costs and harvest weights and storage dates, they found something striking. The families who made it through the worst years of the Depression without significant food insecurity weren't the ones with the most land. They were the ones with the most strategic gardens, smaller plots, planted smarter, with crops selected for exactly these 3 criteria: yield, storage, low input. The average Depression-era kitchen garden covered about 2,000 square feet. That's roughly the size of a 2-car garage footprint, and families were pulling 800 to 1,200 pounds of food from that space annually. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry, because at today's grocery prices, that's somewhere between $1,500 and $2,800 worth of produce, grown from seed packets that cost less than $20 total. Resilience was the 4th unspoken rule. These crops had to handle what the weather threw at them. A late frost that killed the neighbor's tomato seedlings, a dry July that cracked the clay soil into plates, a wet August that rotted anything that sat too long in standing water. The crops that made the list were the ones that didn't collapse under pressure. Sweet potatoes thrive in heat and drought. Winter squash shrugs off cool snaps and keeps maturing on the vine. Pole beans keep producing even when other crops stall, pushing out new pods as fast as you pick the old ones. These plants were selected by generations of hard experience, not by a marketing team. Caloric density mattered too. This is a point that modern gardening culture almost entirely ignores. Most popular home garden crops, salad greens, cucumbers, zucchini, are nutritionally thin. They're mostly water. They taste good, but they won't keep a family fed through a crisis. The crops on this list were chosen because they deliver real calories. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, dried beans, winter squash, these are foods that can anchor a meal, not just garnish one. A family eating from this garden isn't eating salads and hoping for the best. They're eating food that fuels actual work, food that keeps children from going to bed hungry, food that carries real weight. The 8 crops that made this list have been the backbone of serious kitchen gardens for generations. Not hobby gardens, not Instagram gardens, working gardens, gardens that were expected to produce or people went hungry. Every one of these crops can be grown from inexpensive seed. Every one of them produces a meaningful yield in a small space. Every one of them stores well without refrigeration. And every one of them has been proven, across decades of hard seasons, to perform when conditions aren't ideal. The clock was already ticking. The families who figured this out in 1932 had a head start. The question now is whether you'll have one too. The same knowledge that built those families' food security through the worst economic collapse in American history was about to be tested again, this time on a global scale. The year is 1845. Ireland, a country of 8 million people, is about to discover what happens when a single food crop disappears overnight. The potato isn't just food here, it is survival, it is currency, it is the difference between a family that makes it through winter and one that doesn't. 1 million people will be dead within 5 years. Another million will flee. The lesson written in that catastrophe isn't about potatoes failing. It's about what happens when people stop growing their own and become dependent on a system they don't control. When the system fails, and systems always fail eventually, there is no backup. There is nothing between you and hunger except whatever you had the foresight to grow yourself. That lesson is older than Ireland, and it's more relevant today than most people want to admit. Here's the number that changes everything. A single 10 by 10 foot garden bed that's 100 square feet, roughly the size of a small bathroom, can produce more than 50 pounds of potatoes in a single season. 50 pounds. From a patch of ground most people would use for nothing. No other vegetable on earth delivers that kind of caloric return in that kind of space. Not tomatoes, not lettuce, not peppers. Potatoes. Old-timers knew this without running the math. They didn't need spreadsheets, they needed fed families. And potatoes fed families when everything else failed. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. The families who planted potatoes in 1930, in 1931, in the early desperate years of the Great Depression, weren't making some grand philosophical statement. They were just doing what their grandparents had done. They were planting the crop that didn't ask much and gave back everything. But what nobody saw coming was how completely the rest of the food system was about to collapse around them. It is now the middle of summer, 1932. The bread lines stretch around city blocks. Grocery store shelves in rural towns are unreliable at best, empty at worst. But in the garden behind a farmhouse in rural Ohio, something extraordinary is happening quietly. The potato plants are dying back. The leaves have gone yellow at the edges, then brown, then flat against the ground. That's not a problem, that's the signal. When the leaves yellow and fall, the harvest begins. A single family digs their 100 square foot bed and pulls out 63 pounds of potatoes. They weigh them on a kitchen scale, the needle swinging past each mark with a satisfying thud of weight. They count them. They sort them by size, setting aside the smallest ones in a separate pile, the ones no bigger than a golf ball, the ones with the thin papery skins still clinging tight. They stack the rest in wooden crates in the root cellar, where the temperature stays a steady 50 degrees, where the air smells of earth and cool stone, where the light never reaches. The crates sit on wooden slats raised off the floor to keep the air moving underneath. The father checks them every 2 weeks through the winter, turning the top layer, pulling anything soft before it can spread. He moves through the cellar in the dark by feel, his hands reading the surface of each crate the way a blind man reads a page. No canning required, no freezing, no electricity, no special equipment. Just cool, just dark, just dry. Those potatoes will last until March. Some will last longer. But what makes potatoes genuinely extraordinary isn't just the yield. It's the self-sufficiency loop that kicks in after the first season. You don't buy seed potatoes again. You save the smallest ones from your harvest, the ones no bigger than a golf ball, the ones grocery stores would never sell, and you plant those next spring. The crop funds itself. It reproduces itself. Year after year after year, the cost approaches zero. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Nobody stood up in the agricultural bulletins of 1932 and announced that the humble potato was quietly saving rural families while economists argued about monetary policy in Washington. It just happened. Quietly, reliably, the way good crops do. And here's what the old-timers understood about potato soil that modern gardeners often miss. Potatoes don't need rich soil. They actually prefer soil that's a little lean, a little sandy, a little rough. They push through compacted ground that would stop other vegetables cold. They establish deep root systems that find moisture other plants can't reach. Once they're in the ground and growing, they are remarkably drought-tolerant, not fragile hothouse flowers that need constant watering and feeding, but rugged, stubborn plants that want to survive as badly as the families growing them. But what nobody saw coming was the price signal that would arrive nearly a century later. Pull up any grocery store receipt from the past 3 years. Find the potatoes. Now find a receipt from 5 years ago. The numbers don't match anymore. Potato prices have climbed sharply. The USDA's own data confirms it. Russets, Yukon Golds, red potatoes, all up. The reasons are layered: fuel costs, fertilizer prices, labor shortages, transportation bottlenecks. Every link in the industrial food chain got more expensive simultaneously, and potatoes, being heavy and perishable in their commercial form, absorbed every single cost increase: the fuel to run the harvesting equipment, the fertilizer to push industrial yields, the refrigerated trucks to move them from Idaho to your state, the warehouse space to hold them, the plastic bags to package them. Every one of those costs went up. Every one of them landed on the price tag. But here's the thing about growing your own. Those cost increases don't exist for you. Your fuel cost is zero. Your fertilizer cost is zero. Your transportation cost is the walk from the garden to the kitchen. And your seed cost, after the first season, is the handful of golf ball-sized potatoes you set aside in a paper bag last October. The old-timer who planted potatoes in 1932 wasn't insulated from the Depression because she was lucky. She was insulated because she had made a decision the previous spring that removed her from the price system entirely. She didn't pay Depression prices for potatoes. She didn't pay any price for potatoes. She grew them. That's the play. That's always been the play. And it scales. A family of 4, eating potatoes 3 or 4 times a week, consumes roughly 200 pounds of potatoes a year. That sounds like a lot. It isn't. 300 square feet of garden, 3 10-by-10 beds, can produce that entire supply. 300 square feet, the size of a 1-car garage, 3 beds, a few weekends of work in spring, and then a harvest that carries a family through most of the year. But what nobody saw coming was the second crop on this list. The one that doesn't just feed you, the one that actually rebuilds the soil your potatoes just depleted. The potato wasn't done yet, not even close. The old-timer's garden had a system. Potatoes were just the opening move. The next crop wasn't chosen randomly. It was chosen because it does something no other vegetable can do. It gives back more than it takes. The potato had weeks before the fall planting window would close, and the clock had already started. Late July. A garden somewhere in rural Tennessee, 1934. The Depression is 2 years past its official bottom, but nobody in this county has felt the recovery yet. The pole beans are climbing their strings. They've been climbing for 6 weeks. They will keep climbing until October. The woman tending this garden planted 1 packet of seeds in late May. Cost her 11 cents. She pushed each seed into the soil with her thumb, knuckle deep, spaced 8 inches apart, along a line she'd drawn with a stick. She planted them in a single 20-foot row along the south fence, pushed bamboo poles into the ground at each end, ran twine between them at 6-inch intervals up to shoulder height, and walked away. She came back when the beans were ready, and they were always ready. This is the crop that old-timers called the set-it-and-forget-it plant. And they weren't being casual, they were being precise. Most people never heard about this part. While bush beans produce 1 flush of pods and then quit, pole beans keep going. They produce continuously from midsummer straight through the first frost. 1 planting, 1 packet of seeds, months of harvest. The plant doesn't stop. It just keeps climbing and producing and feeding whoever is willing to pick. But that's only the beginning of what makes pole beans extraordinary. August 1934. The garden is producing more beans than the family can eat fresh. This is not a problem. This is the plan. They eat fresh beans through August, snapping them into a pot each evening, the sound sharp and clean in the quiet kitchen. The children sit at the table and snap alongside their mother, the pile shrinking, the pot filling. They put up jars of canned beans in September, the lid sealing with a pop that meant another meal secured, each jar lined up on the shelf with the date written in pencil on the lid. And then in October, when the first frost is coming and the season is ending, they do something the old-timers called the final gift. They stop picking. They let the last flush of pods stay on the vine. They let them dry completely. The pods turn yellow, then brown, then papery and light. They rattle when you shake them. The seeds loose inside like small stones in a paper drum. The woman moves down the row in the October cold, pulling each dry pod free with a twist of her wrist, dropping them into her apron held up like a basket, the weight of the harvest growing with each step. Inside each pod are seeds, fully mature, viable, ready to plant next spring. And the timing of what happened next? Almost too perfect. The woman who planted 11 cents worth of seeds in May walks out to her dying bean vines in late October and collects enough seed to plant 3 times the row she planted this year. She doesn't buy seeds next spring. She doesn't need to. The crop gave her next year's crop for free, and the year after that, and every year after that, stretching forward indefinitely, as long as she keeps doing the same thing. This is what the old-timers meant when they talked about a crop paying for itself, not just in food, in seed, in future harvests, in a loop that the commercial food system has no way to interrupt. But the financial arithmetic of pole beans goes deeper than free seeds. Dried beans store for years, not months, years. The same plant that gives you fresh green beans in August gives you dried protein in October. You're not growing 2 crops, you're growing 1 crop that delivers 2 completely different food products at 2 completely different points in the season. Fresh eating, long-term storage, from the same seeds, from the same 20-foot row. A pound of dried beans at the grocery store costs somewhere between $2 and $3 today. A single pole bean plant, let to dry at the end of season, can produce a quarter pound of dried beans. A 20-foot row of pole beans, which you planted from 1 packet of seeds, contains roughly 20 to 25 plants. Do the math. That's 5 to 6 pounds of dried beans from 1 row. $12 to $18 of grocery store value, from 11 cents worth of seeds that you'll never buy again. And then there's the soil. You'd think someone would have said something about this in every gardening book ever written. The old-timers didn't need to read it. They could see it. They could feel it in the soil the following spring, darker, looser, richer than it had been the year before. They pressed a handful, and it crumbled differently. It held moisture longer. It smelled deeper, like something alive had moved through it and left something behind. Pole beans are legumes. Legumes fix nitrogen. That means the roots of the bean plant form a partnership with soil bacteria, a partnership that pulls nitrogen directly out of the air and deposits it into the soil. When the season ends and you cut the plants down and turn the roots under, you're not depleting your garden, you're fertilizing it. You're leaving behind a deposit of the exact nutrient that next year's potatoes will need. This is not a coincidence. Old-timer gardens were not random collections of vegetables. They were systems. Potatoes deplete nitrogen. Beans replace it. Plant them in rotation, and you have a garden that feeds itself indefinitely without a single bag of purchased fertilizer. The woman in Tennessee in 1934 didn't know the word nitrogen cycle. She knew that beans went where potatoes had been, and potatoes went where beans had been, and the garden kept producing year after year without getting tired. She knew it worked. She didn't need to know why. The reckoning comes in the form of a grocery store receipt, not from 1934, from last month. Dried beans. Up. Canned beans. Up. Fresh green beans. Up. Every form of the crop that costs almost nothing to grow at home has gotten more expensive in the commercial system. The reasons are the same reasons everything is more expensive. Energy, labor, transport, the whole chain, and protein, specifically, has been hit harder than almost any other food category. Dried beans, once the cheapest protein source on any shelf, have climbed steadily as demand rises and supply tightens. But here's what the grocery store receipt doesn't show you. It doesn't show you the 11-cent packet of seeds that starts the loop. It doesn't show you the free seeds you collect in October. It doesn't show you the nitrogen you're putting back into the soil. It doesn't show you the dried beans you're storing in mason jars in your pantry, untouched by inflation, immune to supply chain disruptions, sitting there quietly waiting. It doesn't show you the fresh beans you ate through August and September without spending $1. It doesn't show you the canned jars lined up on the shelf, each one representing a meal that the price system can no longer touch. One planting, months of harvest. That is not a gardening tip. That is a food security strategy. The old-timers didn't separate those two things. They never understood why anyone would. A single packet of pole bean seeds costs less than a cup of coffee. It plants a 20-foot row. That row produces fresh food from July through October. It produces dried beans for long-term storage. It fixes nitrogen in the soil. It generates free seed for next year. And it asks almost nothing in return. No fertilizer, no constant watering, no complicated care schedule. You plant it. You pick it. You let the last flush dry. You collect the seeds. You do it again next year. The old-timer in Tennessee did this for 40 years. The woman who taught her did it for 40 years before that. The knowledge moved from hand to hand, generation to generation, not because anyone wrote it down, but because it worked so reliably that nobody could imagine stopping. One planting, months of harvest, that didn't last as common knowledge, and that's the loss nobody talks about. But the third crop on this list operates on a completely different logic. It doesn't just feed you through summer. It doesn't just store through winter. It thrives in the exact conditions where every other crop fails. Heat, drought, poor soil. The conditions that are becoming more common every single year as the climate shifts and the water tables drop and the growing seasons grow more unpredictable. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The grocery shelves were stocked. The prices seemed manageable. People stopped thinking about where food came from. They stopped thinking about what would happen if the shelves weren't stocked. They stopped thinking about the gap between what they could buy and what they could grow. That gap kept widening, quietly, steadily, the way debt does when nobody is watching the interest, the way a root cellar empties when nobody is counting what's left, the way a skill disappears when nobody bothers to pass it on. The ground remembers everything we forgot. Food prices keep climbing, except now you have the answer.